בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, בוקר טוב. Today we have a very special hero, and in the Sefer, I think this Sefer is very known. איש צדיק היה. It was first published in 72, I think, or at least my edition is from 72, and it was also translated to English. Tzadik in our time. So a very special man whose life affected many, many people in his life and even after his death. And the title, as you see, is Ish Tzadik Haya, and the same author has published another, it's not a sequel, it's more stories, additional stories, about 20 years after the publication of the first Sefer, which is called Tzadik Yesod Olam. And as I saw now my Sfarim, and so he says, oh, another Tzadik. But here it's very interesting because he obviously every one of the people we speak here about was a Tzadik. Was a Tzadik, was a Rav, was a teacher, was a genius, was everything. And each one of them, you may say, or many of them had specific niches, professions as tzaddikim, as rabbis. Right? So some were poskim, so they were decisors. Some were teachers. Some were public leaders. Some were Rashi Yeshivot, etc., etc., etc. And here we speak about someone that was no thing of these. I mean, he was a Talmid Chacham. Obviously, he was a Talmid Chacham, and he was, as we would speak about, he was a mashgiach in basically in a Talmud Torah, Etz Chaim, an elementary school. He didn't write any significant Torah chidushim. He didn't lead people. He was not a Rosh Yeshiva or a head of an important institution. So why we speak about him? So he was a tzaddik. His niche, his profession, his speciality was being a tzaddik. And that's something very, very interesting. Now, to some people, his admirers even his family, they find it difficult. So a few years ago, when I was preparing this shiur, so I was looking in the library over all the entries under the name Rav Aryeh Levin to see if there are other biographies, other Sfarim. And I saw that a few years ago they published a Perush on the Mishnah, Mishnat Aryeh, from a manuscript of his that they had found. So I have not have it at home. I walked in the library, I walked to the shelf, and I took it out. And I looked at the first volume. I wanted to see what's going on. And there is an introduction, akdama, written by, I think one of his grandsons that was behind the publishing. And he explains how they found the manuscript, and they went to some of the Gdolim. Some of them are his relatives, the Rabbi Aryeh Levin's relatives, to ask if the manuscript should be published. And some of very important leading Rabbanim were very hesitant about publishing because he wrote it. He didn't have many Sfarim when he wrote it. He was young, it seems, when he wrote this manuscript of this Perush LaMishnah. So it was not necessarily of the, I want to be careful, but it was not necessarily of the high level that they thought would be appropriate for such a great man, so maybe it's better not to publish it. But this grandson, the man that was putting that into publication, you read what he wrote, and it's very clear that he felt so uncomfortable Here is his great-great-grandfather, or is an important rabbi, and there's no perush on the Torah. There's no chidushim, only these nice stories, which may make you warm and fuzzy in the stomach, but no hard Torah. So it was so important for him to publish anything from his grandfather that he published it, although maybe the level is not of such a high quality. And he writes in the beginning, there is like an apology saying, you should know that that does not represent the full extent of my grandfather level and Torah quality. And to me, it's so interesting. So again, I didn't really went through the Perush because after you read such an introduction, so I didn't go. I'm sure that it has some nice, interesting Torah chidushim, but you see the opposition of some people to just seeing this man as a tzaddik. No, he was also a great rabbi, and again, he may have been. I don't, of course, oppose it in any way. It's just to me that in itself is a very teaching story about some of the, I would almost say, some of the novelty, some of the chidush in the very life and example that this man set forth. So who was he? Rav Aryeh Levin, who was called Tzadik Yerushlalmi, the Tzadik of Yerushalaim, already in his lifetime. So he was a legend already in his lifetime. The Tzadik Yerushalaim, or Avi Asirim, the father of prisoners. So Rav Aryeh Levin was born in 1885 in a small city, Jewish, it was not even a Jewish city. It was a small city named Orle. It is near Bialystok. Bialystok is more known. Back then, all was part of the Russian Empire. Nowadays, that's Poland. His father his name was Rabbi Binyamin Beinush. He was known as an extreme, straight and honest man. And also, maybe not accidentally or coincidentally, he was extremely poor. And that's the fate of usually of extremely strict and straight people. So he was very, very poor. And Reb Aryeh was born when his father was already of somewhat of an old age, so he was already retired. Now, he was poor even when he was working, but after being retired, Reb Aryeh was born into extreme poverty. Extreme poverty. I think I don't know the personal history of the people sitting around, but I would guess that for most of us, it is even hard to fathom the levels of poverty he was born into. When he was 6 years old, he was sent by his father to his uncle, meaning the father's older brother, the uncle of Aryeh, the young Aryeh. When he was 6, he was sent to him to learn Torah, to learn Chumash, but it seems from the stories that it was not only to learn Chumash, but also just to have something to eat. So these are the levels that we speak about. He learned there for a year by his uncle, and then he returned to his parents' home. And a few years later, he began to look for yeshiva. Before his bar mitzvah, at the age of 12, he tried to go in the beginning to Brisk, and then he continued to Volozhin. In Volozhin, that is not the classic Volozhin, that's the new Volozhin. The classic Volozhin was closed, as we told a few times, when he was 7. A few years later, it was reopened with Rafael Shapira as the Rosh Yeshiva. So he came to this new Volozhin. However, he was rejected because of his young age. Now, again, this is a word that for me, it's very difficult even to understand. So a boy, 12 years old, comes to your yeshiva, you're the Rosh Yeshiva, or the Mashgiach, or the man responsible for reception, comes a 12 years old boy in a train, and then you say to him, you are too young to be accepted, go. Again, it's just a different word. It's a different word. It's something that I cannot understand the parent sending. I cannot understand the Rosh Yeshiva rejecting such a boy. You don't know. Again, this is not judgmental in any way or sense. Just think that this is very removed from our experiences of life. I think no one sitting around this table would ever send a 12 years old boy just by himself back in a Russian train to who knows where. Who knows where. Anyhow, he continued. He was very disappointed. He really wanted to learn in Volozhin. I mean, I didn't say. He was an Ilui. He was learning excellently, and he really wanted to learn Torah, and he would invest day and night in Torah learning. He prepared himself to the test. He hoped that he'd be put to the test in Volozhin and be accepted, but the Rosh Yeshiva didn't even want to hear. So he was sent away. He moved through a few yeshivot. It's very interesting. Again, so until the age of 14, he was already in 4 or 5 yeshivot. Just moving around. He really liked Rabbanim, Gdolei Torah. So he would come to yeshiva, make very good connection. Now, already in very young age, he was a people's man. So he was a person's person, how do you say? Yeah, people's person. So he was very warm. And he was able to connect to all types, to people from all walks of life. That was something that would accompany him to the rest of his life. So he would speak with a Gadol Torah, he would speak to him about Torah. He would speak with one of the boys, he would speak with him about boys' things. He would speak with the cleaner. So he would speak about cleaning. He was always very, very, very adaptable and understood how to speak with people about what is interesting to them and in their eye level. He is, in the age of 13, by the way, he celebrates bar mitzvah. He is far from home. Years later, he would tell, and the story appears in this biography. This is not a biography. It's a collection of stories, to be honest. But it's a wonderful sefer. I hope that I don't do it every year because then it's cheapening it. But this time I really recommend reading the sefer either in Hebrew or in English. Tzadik. I think many of you did. Because at a certain point it was a very fashionable book. It was given as bar or bat mitzvah presents. Extremely, it's a wonderful book, very inspiring, very, very inspiring. I highly recommend. So it tells that he spoke with Aryeh Levin. The author, Simcha Raz, was a Dati guy. And as a child, Rabbi Aryeh Levin, we'd get to that, but Rabbi Aryeh Levin ended up in Yerushalaim. And as you can maybe guess from the nickname Tzadik Hirushlalmi, the Tzadik from Yerushalaim. So he ended up in Yerushalaim, and Simcha Raz was a boy, and there's many other boys that were going around there. Rabbi Aryeh Levin was helping him and being mekarev him. So he really took it to his heart. And after the death of Rabbi Aryeh Levin, he decided he would collect all the stories. So he collected the story about the bar mitzvah, that Rabbi Aryeh Levin had no bar mitzvah. And because he was away from home, and anyhow in his home, they had no money to give him. So he asked him, how did you celebrate your bar mitzvah? And Rabbi Aryeh said, I took a tefillin, I borrowed tefillin from a friend, I put them on, I wore them, and that was my bar mitzvah. No parents, no drasha, no nothing. So again, I think it's so far removed from us, because we may understand sending the child to yeshiva, but if that's his bar mitzvah, you'd expect, again, I don't know what to expect, but for us, I would guess that the parents would come to celebrate with the boy would return for a week to home, to celebrate bar mitzvah, no? That is something that in Lithuania it was the minute to celebrate. The boy would give a drasha, nothing. Not even new pair of shoes. At a certain point, in 1897, to be exact, so he's 12 or 13, and he reaches Slotsk. In Slotsk, there was a big yeshiva headed by Reb Iser Zalman Meltzer, who would later come to Yerushalayim, a very prominent Torah scholar, very, very prominent Torah scholar. And he would become Reb Aryeh's rabbi to the rest of his life. Also in Yerushalaim, as we will see, he would be the one to give Reb Aryeh his position as a mashgiach, as a spiritual, I guess, teacher in this Talmud Torah, in this elementary school of Yeshivat Etz Chaim. So he's learning there with great shkida. So he is learning day and night, skipping meals, sleeping in the Beit Midrash. Now, the order there was that how would the child eat? There was no dormitory, there was no dining room. The yeshivot, most of them were not built that way. Part of Volozhin was special. But in Slotsk, there was no dining room. So the children would eat by the balebatim of the city. And each child would have this balebat for Sunday, and this balebat for Monday, and this balebat for Tuesday. Of course, all of that was done. Sometimes they would pay them some small amount of money, but many times it's just tzedakah. And years later, as I said, Rabbi Yisrael Zalman Metzer, the Rosh Yeshiva, was also the Rosh Yeshiva where he worked in Yerushalaim years later. And the story goes that every Leil Shabbat, Rabbi Aryeh would come to the Rosh Yeshiva to speak in Torah. And they would sit and have a small Lithuanian tish. So they would sit and learn Torah together. And that's how tish would look like by the Mitnagdik standard. So they sat there and they learned, and sometimes they would just speak about their memories from the good old days in Slotsk. And suddenly, Rabbi Yisrael Zalman asked Rabbi Aryeh, tell me, Rabbi Aryeh, where did you eat each day? And Rabbi Aryeh was able to give him 3 names. Now, Rabbi Aryeh Levin was not someone to forget names or people, just not the type of person. So Rabbi Yisrael Zalman began to press him, where did you eat in the other, I said 4 names, the other 3 days in the week? And Rabbi Yisrael Zalman, in the end, had to admit that he just didn't eat. For 2 years, he was in Slotsk, and he had no food, he had no meal on 3 days of the week. So he'd eat day on, day off. At the age of 12, 13. And Rabbi Yisrael Zalman was shocked. And they finished the learning session, and Rabbi Aryeh went back home. An hour or 2 later, it's already in the middle of the night of Leil Shabbat, and the wife of Rabbi Yisrael Zalman Metzer is knocking at the Levin's home. And Chaya Tzipora, the wife of Chana Tzipora, that's Rabbi Aryeh's Levin wife. She opens the door, and Bila Hinda, the Rebbetzin of Rabbi Yisrael Zalman, tells her, you must ask your husband to come back to our home, because my husband cannot sleep. He's so tormented because of what he learned, that he had a student in his yeshiva that he didn't know that he's not eating 3 days a week. And Rabbi Yisrael Zalman had to go back to his rabbi's home, and Rabbi Yisrael Zalman was asking for mechila, and how would I be able to face the divine judgment, knowing that I had students they didn't. And Rabbi Yisrael Zalman said, Rabbi Levin told him, there were no other students. It was just me, because I was not interested in eating. I was interested in learning. And that's a story that shows you something, I think, about the type of personality. So these were his years in Slotsk. And in 1902, after 5 years in Slotsk, at the age of 17, he decides that time come that he would go back to Volozhin and learn there. And now he's old enough. So he comes to Volozhin, he's admitted in, he's accepted, he learns in Volozhin for 2 years, and then in 1904 happened something that for us is very, very, very far history, but back then it was very important, and that is the war of Russia and Japan. And now, why do we care about the war of Russia and Japan? We care. That's because Russia was losing heavily. And that was very humiliating for a nation that saw itself as a European superpower, and it's losing to some, I mean, in their eyes, some ASEAN monkeys, right? That's how they looked at it. How can it be? So Russia was recruiting everyone, including, of course, the Jews. And because Reb Aryeh Levin is in the ripe age of 17, 18, obviously he does not, he's a candidate, he doesn't want to stay in Russia. He has to run away. Now, other Jews that were rich enough were able to pay off. He does not have any money, neither his parents have. So he decides that that's the right time, the April time, to make Aliyah to Eretz Israel. So in 1904, he leaves Volozhin and he goes back to his parents' home in order to make his final goodbye and arrange his things for making Aliyah. However, he comes there, and obviously they were extremely poor, as I said, and there was nothing there. And he describes in his memories, there are short, he wrote a short memory, or like a very short terse autobiography for his children. And some of it was published by Reb Simcha Raz. Now, it's a riddle for me, because he wrote, he typed it. He also give you some facsimile photocopies of the actual autobiography. But then when you read what Reb Aryeh wrote and what Simcha Raz typed, it doesn't add up. So if he wanted to hide some things, why did he publish the photocopy? I can't make my hands and you know, it's I guess someone that is more historic oriented would be able to understand what happened there. Maybe you need to interview a few people. I didn't do that. So I'm little in a loss about what to do when there are just contradictions between what is photocopied and what I made some effort to read what is written there in his own handwriting, and it's not what is typed. I don't understand it. I'm just telling you what I understand. So from what I understand, he came to his home and there was nothing there to eat. His mother was in pain because her child returns after years. They didn't see, and you know, no phone and a few letters. And she doesn't even have something to give him to eat when he returned. That was the situation at home. His father was very, very sick, so he couldn't leave them. He understood that he just can't leave them. And he stayed for another whole year. After a year, he was very hard pressed because he understood that the Russians are on his tail. And if he would not make his living immediately, he would not be able to stay at his parents' home anyway, because either he would be recruited or that he's fleeing. But staying home was not an option. And he has a very sad description, because that was the last time he saw his parents, how he's saying his goodbyes, his farewells. Now his father cannot stand up from his bed. So he cannot even being melave him, he cannot accompany him to the railway station. So he takes his goodbye in the bed. And then his mother accompanies him to the railway station. And he says, I will just read you a few lines. He says, I was only 19, but I had strong emotions of happiness and sadness mixed. I was happy because I am going to Eretz Israel. But I was sad because I had to say my goodbyes, להיפרד from my father and teacher. And that's when his disease is so sick. And I have to leave him. Like, they just feel what he is feeling. And he says, I feel it as it is living in front of me. As I was, I mean, he's writing many years later. He says, it's like it's living inside me, the scene where I say goodbye to my father and he puts his hands, his grim hands, on my head and he's blessing me with tears. And I am taking his hands and kissing them. And to this day, when I speak about it, I have this emotion of unending ga'agwim, belongings. Yeah, longings. ובשעה שנפרדתי לא היה ביכולתו לקום ממיטתו, when I departed, he couldn't stand from his bed, רק אמי מורתי האישה כשרה בנשים, so only my mother and teacher, אמי מורתי, was the kosher of all women, הכשרה בנשים, ליוותה אותי עד העיר אורלה, שם נפרדתי ממנה, so that's where we separated, for good, and she was my beloved mother. For me, she was the symbol of suffering and of goodness. So he's making Aliyah. He is the only Jew on a boat full with Russian Christians coming to the Holy Land, right, to visit the Holy Land. Tzalyanim, what is the English word? Pilgrims? Pilgrims. So he's the only Jew. You can only imagine right now. Now, these Russian Christians are not necessarily Jew lovers. So I cannot, again, he doesn't write too much about his experience, just writes, I was happy to go down from the boat when we reached Yafo. So he's going, and immediately he's going to Rav Kook. Rav Kook is the Rav of Yafo at the time, and as I said, for him, every Gadol Batorah was someone immediately to cling to. So he is going to Rav Kook, and he makes a great impression on Rav Kook, and Rav Kook gives him a recommendation, and he goes to Yerushalaim. He would stay connected to Rav Kook to the rest of his life. He would suffer because of that, because in Yerushalaim there were many people that thought that they were very righteous. And being righteous meant, of course, opposing those that are not righteous in their eyes. So they opposed, and the word oppose is really an understatement. And Rav Aryeh Levin many times took bizyonot. He was degraded by them, but he was of a nature that it went under him, above him, next to him. He couldn't care. I don't think that he couldn't care less. Maybe that's too much. No, I would guess that every person would care, but he was able to carry himself and to do what he thought was the right thing to do. By the way, his daughter, many years later, the daughters of Rav Aryeh Levin, would be married to Rav Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, who was one of the greatest Haredi rabbis of the last generation, that passed away just a few years ago. So his daughter was married to Rav Eliashiv, and the Mesader Kiddushin was Rav Kook, who also made the Shidduch. Yeah, so that's it's an interesting word, much more complicated than what maybe some newspaper would want us to believe. We'll speak about that. Yeah, it says both sides. It's so happy to see people continue to live. However, there were tragedies that happened because of this poverty, as we will see. So in 1905, as I said, he comes to Yerushalaim, and he's a beautiful story that he comes to Yerushalaim, and he visits a certain rabbi, and they speak in Divrei Torah, and the rabbi gives him a supper, beautiful, and then they finish, and the Rav says, I would accompany you to the door. And he accompanies him to the door and sends him away. Now he's a 19-year-old boy, no money at all. He spent the very little he had, he spent on the boat. So he has no money at all, and he's now in Yerushalayim, and just at the middle of the night in Yerushalayim. Now, I'm sure that the Rav thought that he has somewhere to stay, and he didn't feel comfortable to ask to sleep at this rabbi's home. So he thought to himself, I would do what I did in the yeshivot. I would come to some Beit Midrash and sleep on the bench. And he sees a Jew going on the street, an elderly Jew, and he asked him, where is the Beit Midrash? So the Jew says to him, why do you want now to go to the Beit Midrash? It's dark there. You have to understand, it's before electricity. You don't be able to land there, and there is no Ma'ariv anymore. So what are you looking for in the Beit Midrash? Aryeh says to him, I need a place to sleep. This Jew let him sleep at his home until he got married. Yeah, and again, years later, during World War II, the Brisker Rav, which about whom we would have to speak, Reb Velvale, Reb Zev Soloveitchik, the son of Reb Chaim, came in the middle of the war. He lost a wife, children. He was in a very bad shape. He came. It was a very known Talmid Chacham in all of Europe. So when he came to Yerushalaim, all the great Rabbanim came to him to speak in Divrei Torah and enjoy his company and his sicha, and he enjoyed theirs. And then they left. And now he was giving an apartment, but there was no food in the apartment. And the Rabbanim, the Rabbanim, they are focused on Divrei Torah. And no one thought about what this poor man is going to eat for supper or for tomorrow morning. The only one that thought about that was of Aryeh Levin, who remembered his experience of coming completely in poverty to Yerushalaim. So he made sure when he came, all the Rabbanim went to speak in Divrei Torah. He let go of the Divrei Torah. Instead, he was walking around the house and stoking it with food, with cleaning material, with everything that is needed in order to run a home. That's the type of person. So that's the story of how he came to Yerushalaim. Now, very quickly, he is becoming known as an extreme lamdan. He was a lamdan. He was a Talmid. As I said, he was a Talmid Chacham. That's why it's so difficult for some people that he didn't left any sefarim. But he was a Talmid Chacham. I don't know if he was the most great Talmid Chacham, the greatest Talmid Chacham in Yerushalayim. I would guess that not. But he was a Talmid Chacham, and he became known. And at a certain point, he's being meshudach to the daughter of Rav David Shapira, who was an important rabbi, and no less important, his proposed wife, Hannah, was the sister of the wife of Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank became the Rav of Yerushalaim after Rav Shmuel Solan. So that's very high. And Rav Aryeh Levin would become connected. You may say that in the Litvish world of Yerushalayim, right? There are the Hasidim, there are the Litvaks. So in the Litvish world, the Yeshivish world, as it is called today, of Yerushalayim, he was extremely connected. That was his world. And as I said, a few years later, he is being accepted as the Mashgiach in Etz Chaim and living from this very modest salary. He lived in great poverty throughout all of his life. And at the beginning, because he was forced to, and then it shows, it was part of his humbleness to live in such a state. Again, a story for many years later. He was, as I said, he was renowned, he was very famous as a great Tzadik and Baal Chesed. And the city of Yerushalaim wanted to give him an oil tanur, oven to heat, an heating element. In the freezing cold of Yerushalaim, he lived for decades without an oven. Again, for us, I don't know if we can even imagine that. I mean, we cannot live in Tel Mond without, right, without some a heater. And he lived there in Yerushalaim, and they say that one day someone came into his house and he was learning during the day, and he had a candle lit on the table. So why do you need a candle? Shraga betihara maya hanelan, a candle in the daylight, why it is needed? And Rav Aryeh Levin answered, that way I can heat my fingers, so I would be able to turn the pages. And so the city of Yerushalayim wanted to buy him an oven, and he refused. He said, it's too much of ha'olam hazeh. Now these are stories that are corroborated. Some stories here I find difficult to believe, but that's a story that is told from a few people. It seems that more than one man wanted to buy him a heating oven. He didn't. He just refused. He highly refused. His marriage were legendary. I think that many people heard the story about he and his wife coming to the doctor, and his wife had a problem with her leg, and he told the doctor, my wife's foot is hurting us. My wife's foot is hurting us. And hurting us. So he was feeling the pain. Now, I had a sicha, a talk by, again, he is a grandson named Benji Levin, who is an American, by the way, and he's giving talks in beautiful English about his grandfather. He was zoche to learn with his grandfather in his late age. And if you can just Google on the internet, on the YouTube, and you'd find some of his talks, beautifully, speaking beautifully. And he's making this emphasis that Rav Aryeh Levin didn't say, our leg is hurting. He was not controlling, taking control over his wife. No, it's her leg, but it is also hurting me. Which I think is a beautiful note. But there are many other stories. Immediately after the marriage, his wife sent almost all of the nedunya that she brought with her. She sent it back to Europe to Reb Aryeh's parents. And not because he asked her, because she wanted. Now, why did they want the money? Of course, they needed money because they needed money. They were very poor, but also because the Russian government fined his parents because their son was running away from the army. So they put a fine on his parents. And she said that would be inappropriate that they would pay for our ability to stay here in Yerushalaim. So she sent all the money they had from the wedding to his parents. After her and she supported him throughout all of his life. She never asked or demanded anything. She was cooking the food that he brought, as we'll speak about later, to the prison and to the leprosy, the leprosy, thank you. The leprosy hospital that he was with. And she of course, she never refused or tried to stop him from doing all of these services, which she did completely for free. But also she was helping him to the best of her ability. And after her ptira, they say that, and that's a story from someone that was with him. So he was on a cab after giving a shiur somewhere, and he was drove back by the cab driver. And the cab driver asked him, where is your home? Where should I take you? Where is your home? And Rabbi didn't give him an answer. And the driver asked a few more times. Then the driver got frustrated and said, where do you want me to take you? And then Rabbi said, he gave him his address. And the man sitting next to him, this was Shlomo Zalman Shargai, was the Rosh of Yerushalaim later. And he told Simcha Raz, so he told him, I asked Reb Aryeh, why didn't you give him the address when you asked where is your home is? So Reb Aryeh told him, after my wife passed, I don't see it as a home anymore. I live there. And that's the address where I want to go down. But my home is not there anymore. Another story that he's telling is that in one Simchat Purim, they had a party on Purim for all of his grandchildren, and the children came, his daughters, and they had a party. And then suddenly put a picture on of a young girl on the table. And they asked him, Saba, who is this young girl? And why do you put them? Maybe it's one of the granddaughters that couldn't make. Why do you put it on the table? He said, all of you are happy. I also want to be happy. When I see my wife, then I can be happy. That's the type of relationship they had. Very strong, very emotional. And of course, they shared, I think they shared the tzadikut. They shared the ideology. They also suffered a lot together. As I said, a lot of it had to do with the extreme poverty they lived in. In 1914, they live in Yerushalaim. He's learning, as I said, he's studying, he's a little teaching for money. In 1914, World War I breaks, and Palestine is in very bad shape. The Turks are angry with the Jews because they suspect, more or less rightly so, that the Jews are in favor of the English. Now, the Jews had very good reasons why to side with the British, because the British were less anti-Semitic than the Turks, so it's very easy. And also for the Zionists, the British were much more in favor of the Zionist program than the Turks. But the Turks were they were deporting people. By the way, you know who was defending the Jews? That's unbelievable. Germany. Germany had strong manufim. so I'm missing the word, ability to, pressure points, you would say, on the Turks. So you remember that the Turks and the Russians and Germany was on one side in World War One, and the French and the British were on the other side, right? So the Germans and the Turks were on the same side, and the Germans were paying the bills, basically, of the Ottoman Empire. And in Germany, there was a strong Jewish element at the time, and serving in the army, some of them in high ranks. And the Jews in Germany created pressure on the German government to press the Ottomans not to basically not to murder their Jews, because the Ottomans in World War One, they made a genocide on the Armenians, and there was no much needed for them to do the same thing with the Jews. The reason, a strong, a central reason why it didn't happen was because of the intervention of the German government. So, you know, that's the irony of history. What can you say? What can you say? So, but life were extremely harsh. There was no food. There was nothing. There was nothing. And during the war, 2 daughters of the couple died, basically out of hunger. That was the how bad the situation was. And in one of the stories that he told, and then was later recorded here in the Sefer, in the book, he says that he once went to a hesped. He was going to Leviot, and he went to a hesped, and suddenly he understands that the man they are burying here is the one that was responsible for giving out tzedakah back then in World War One. And he says that they were speaking in the hesped, the eulogy, saying how nadiv he was, how generous, his door was open, and no one ever came back and not being given. And he said, and I was standing there, and that was not correct, because during World War One, I was sent a specific donation that was addressed to Aryeh Levin in Yerushalaim, and it came through this guy, and he was just supposed, it was not his money, it was my money, and he was just supposed to give it to me, and I had children starving at home, and I went to him, and he told me, I first need to check, maybe there is another Aryeh Levin in Yerushalaim. Now, nowadays, in Yerushalaim, you have many Aryeh Levins, but it was a small city. And this man was just holding the money for weeks. And one of my daughters starved to death. And he says, now I'm staying in his levaya. And I'm hearing how he never attend anyone without giving him. And he said, then I decided I don't want to spade him in my levaya. I don't want to spade, because in the spading, people always miss the mark. And so he wrote this in a will that he doesn't want any spadim. And anyway, it was niftar in Nisan. So his request was fulfilled, and there was no spadim in his levaya. But these are the tragic stories of living in poverty. So 2 daughters deceased, died because of the hunger. The couple lost other 2 boys. So 2 daughters and 2 boys. Again, for us, these are things that cannot be imagined. And I don't want even to try and imagine them. So 2 daughters, 2 boys. One was niftar even before he reached the age of 30 days. Very young. The other was 1.5 years. That was not during World War I. We are already in 1920. He was 1.5 years. And they have the hesped that he wrote on his son here. And I will tell you the truth. I couldn't write it down because it's too heart-wrenching. If you want, you can read it in the Sefer. It describes the son and how and the last day. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult. So it's not that, children were dying, so people were somewhat, they didn't care. It's very, very far from that. They took it very, very much to their heart. But they decided to go on. They had faith, and he is describing that he had a mashber of faith almost. And his wife was menachem him and his wife told him, Aryeh, where is your Yahadut? Where is your faith in the Creator? Where is your faith in Hashem? And she was pushing him to continue. What do we know? What do we know? Yes.
Right after the first war,
yes.
When you had the Spanish flu that broke out,
you
had 20 million people to die.
So maybe also I don't know. Maybe it is. I don't know. I don't think that they even had the means to know from where people were dying. However, his wife also became very, very, very sick. Then they added, by the advice of Rav Kook, they added to her the name Tzipora. She was Hannah, and she became Hannah Tzipora after her illness. Because it's from the pasuk from Yeshayahu, Ketziporim afot ken yagen. So God would save the city as the birds that are flying from their troubles. So they named her Tzipora. And she lived for many years later. In 1917, he becomes the mashgiach, as I said, in Etz Chaim. Etz Chaim was a Talmud Torah in Yerushalaim, which was semi-modern. Now, what do I mean? They didn't teach any limudei chol, don't be confused for a second, chas v'chalila. However, it was modernized in the sense that there was an institution, because before that, what a cheder was, we have to understand. What is a cheder? A cheder means that I am a rabbi, I want to make some, and I have ideology. Anyhow, I would open a Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah is like a daycare. I can just declare that I open the Talmud Torah, and if I can convince someone to give his child, then now I have students. Where would they learn? It depends at my home. If I have a dedicated teaching room, then we can learn in the teaching room. What are the chances that would be? Zero, because the Melamdim were always the most poor people in the community. So you would learn either in the bedroom of the Melamed or in the kitchen. That's how, and no, of course, no program, no nothing, no curriculum. It depends. Some teachers were just gifted, so they were able to teach in a better way. Many of them, it was what it was. And who were the students? So if you are able to convince a guy who is 8 years old, and another guy who is 12 years old, the parents, and another who is 6 years old, that would be your classroom. Now, how do you teach when you have 3 or 4 children, each one in a different age, and each one with different knowledge? And you understand, so it was in a very bad shape. And they wanted to modernize, and they wanted to, I would say, to reform. Obviously, they would not use these words, but they wanted to reform the education system. And that's why they opened the Talmud Torah Etz Chaim, which is a wonderful rose and is a wonderful institution. They even had a yard. You understand what a chidush was? There was a yard for the children to play. And Reb Aryeh Levin, his office as the mashgiach was, there were stairs going down from the building to the yard, and under the stairs, they closed the space, and that was his office. So all the time there would be children running up and down, up and down his office, if that may be called so. And he had a window into the yard, and you would look through the window, and you would see. So now these were times of poverty. Many children went without new clothes, some of them without shoes at all. And there are many stories about that. I'll just tell one or two. So one story about him seeing a child with no shoes. Now, he didn't want to just give him shoes because that would be humiliating for the child. So he would call him in and say, we have a quiz. And there is a prize by the school for those who, when you'd ask him a few questions on the Gemara or the Mishnah or whatever the child is learning, the child always was able to win the quiz, and he would get the prize, which would be a new pair of shoes. So instead of humiliating him by giving him tzedakah, he would empower him by telling him, you know, you are an excellent learner, so here is your prize. You won it in justice. That's something, that's an education, it's the heart of an educator. Another story, beautiful story, that was told to the author by the hero, by the child. So he told him that he once a week, excuse me, in Etz Chaim, they already had a dining room. Once a week, they would serve chocolate pudding. That was the treat that they were able to give. So all the children waited for Thursday for the chocolate pudding. And once a child went in, and another child took his chocolate pudding and stole from him. And this child became so irritated because he waited the whole week. And he went to the table and turned it. These are small, these are young children. He turned it and basically spilled all of the chocolate puddings of all of the children. So you're suspended. And they told him you can only come back to school if you have an approval by Aryeh Levin. Now, Aryeh Levin was so meticulous about not throwing things, and he was poor, and so the child was sure that he's going to be scolded. And he went into, but he has no choice. He went into the office, and Rabbi asked him, please tell me the story. What happened? Now, the child says, it's written, no one before that asked me what happened. They just immediately suspended me because what I did. And it was the first time someone asked me, give your side. So he gave his side. The man said, look, I understand you were irritated. I also have been irritated if I was you. But you acted poorly. Your response was wrong. And he said to him, you understand that your response was, so the child says, yes. And what does it mean to make tshuva? So Rambam says to make tshuva is if you have the same situation and you do not do it again. So says Rav Aryeh Levin, here, I would give you a chocolate pudding. I want to see that you don't spoil it. And he gave him a chocolate pudding. And then he told him, I want to tell you a secret. What's the secret? So you like chocolate, right? So the child says, yes. Rav Aryeh says to him, I also like chocolate. He takes another chocolate pudding and put it to himself. And they both ate chocolate pudding together. And the child says, this shared eating of chocolate pudding changed my life. Changed my life. This is a story. You don't teach it in the seminary, in teacher seminar. That's something that I don't know if you are born with or you develop this sensitivity. I'm sure that his ears as a lonely boy going around all of these yeshivot, I'm sure that it has to do with the way that he was able to see into the heart of these children. In 1927, he begins to visit the jail that was the Russian compound, Migrash Harusim, in Yerushalaim, and he begins to visit the Jewish prisoners in there. Now, in 1927, we speak mainly about criminal. So he was visiting the criminals and was just to lift their spirit a little and maybe to bring a message from the family, make a kiddush, make a tefillah. And again, of course, we all understand the importance that such a role is. And they all describe, it's very interesting, all of these prisoners, they describe the same thing. The warmth of his hands. He would visit and he would shake your hand. But most of us, shake hands and leave. And he would take your hand and put the second hand on your hand. And you just sit there or stand with you and they massage your hand. And people said that this massage, it was so much warmth was going through his body into theirs. And people tell that many of them are not religious. And that's another story that even repeats a few times, that he was smoking. And suddenly he sees Rav Aryeh coming from afar on Shabbat. And how can Rav Aryeh see me with a cigarette on Shabbat? But he didn't have time. So he took the cigarette from behind his back and just stood there and spoke. And Rav Aryeh is holding his hand, and he's holding and he's holding and he's asking and speaking with him. And he doesn't let go. And this guy is standing with the cigarette in his hand, burning his hand. And he said, he had a burn from the cigarette. He never smoked again on Shabbat. I don't say he didn't become religious, he wouldn't go to, but he didn't smoke again on Shabbat. Another story, beautiful story from one of these prisoners that later was released. And one day he's going in the street and Rav Aryeh goes from the other direction. And suddenly Rav Aryeh sees him going to the other side of the street. So Aryeh is not the one to be shy. He's chasing him to the other side of the street. Why do you run away from me? The man said, I don't feel well because I don't have my yarmulke on. I don't have my kippah. I would go to my home. I thought that I would take the kippah on and then I would go back to meet you. And Rav Aryeh said to him, he was a short man. Maybe because also he didn't eat well when he was young. So he was a short man. He said, I am not high. I cannot see if you have a kippah. I only can see to the heart. And you can speak with me always. In 1931, the British are looking for a formal chaplain. They needed a chaplain for the prisoner. That's part of the. It's part of what is the titles that are needed. So they are looking for a chaplain for a Rav for the prison, and Rav Kook recommends Rav Aryeh Levin, who is doing it anyway. So they go and they find the British officer that is responsible is going to Rav Aryeh's home. And there is no phone, of course, nothing. So he has to go to his home. He goes to his home, he finds Rav Aryeh, and he says to him, we want to make you the formal chaplain, the formal Rav of the prison. And Rav Aryeh says, okay, what does it mean? So you mean you have to be between these hours and these hours? Rav Aryeh says, no, I want to be much more than that. So he says, you are allowed to be more, but you should know that the payment, there are no over hours. So I would only pay you according to the hours. He says, payment? Chas v'chalila, should they take money for a mitzvah? And he refused. He refused to take any money or to sign any contract. He said, I am doing mitzvot not because Her Majesty is hiring me for doing mitzvot. I think it was His Majesty in 31. So not because His Majesty is asking me to do mitzvot, I'm doing it because His Majesty is asking me to do mitzvot. And he never took a penny for what he did. Every Shabbat, he would go to the jail. Later, also, he added in Beit Lechem, there were women's prisoners. No, in Beit Lechem. So there were no Jews. So it's only, the Jewish women that were jailed were surrounded. But unfortunately, we can imagine how it looks like by the Arabs there. So he would go there to lift their spirits. Now, in these years, many of the prisoners became the people of the Machtarot, the underground movements, the Haganah, the Etzel, the Lehi, and he would visit them. He became very famous because he met many important people there as prisoners. And later, when they were released and became the heads of the state, then they were trying again to declare him, to give him honorary titles. Of course, he refused to all of these. He didn't do anything for the type or the sake of kavod. But he knew many, many important people. Begin was an admirer of his. Very interesting. So he was very strong in the Etzel, in the Irgun, as they called it. And Geula Cohen, she was a female warrior of the Irgun, of the Etzel, and she was prisoned there in Bethlehem. And she has a whole chapter in her autobiography describing Rav Aryeh Levin. And now again, he is a man of the old world, of the old issue. He is a mashgiach in Etz Chaim. It's very difficult even to describe the separate worlds, but he had a love for every Jew. He didn't care. He really didn't care. And he came there, and she says, now they describe, he didn't shake their hands, the women prisoners. So he would stand there and shake his own hand. That's what they described. That he felt the need, and he was radiating heat by shaking his own hand. And she says, he didn't only came himself. He couldn't took us out to the free world, but he was bringing freedom with him inside. That's a sentence in her autobiography on Rav Aryeh Levin. So he was doing that. I guess that was on Thursday, and Shabbat he was going to the Kele in Yerushalaim. One day he was in the Kotel, and he's hearing a woman crying, and he goes to her. What's going on? Why do you cry? And the woman says, my son is in the leprosy hospital, and I'm terrified. I cannot visit him because I'm worried that I also would get sick. I have other children at home. But on the other hand, I cannot speak with my own son. And from that day on, he took it upon himself every Shabbat, after visiting or before visiting in the jail, he would also go through in Tel Aviv, there was the בית חולים למצורעים, and you'd go through there, and people that would not believe, because everyone was, people were going not on the other side of the street from the hospital of the מצורעים. They would go on the other שכונה. And he would go in and he would sit with them and speak with them. And again, every Shabbat coming week after week after week after week. Now, it's important to understand. He's very well known for him going to the prisoners because of the machtarot. They made him famous. But he didn't begin when it was trendy. And he didn't finish when the state was established. Many years after the establishment of the city, he was continuing to go every week, every Shabbat to the prison. There were only criminals there, but he didn't separate between Jews according to their ideology, or almost I would say even not according to obviously he did separate according to the deeds. Doesn't mean that everyone he would marry his daughter to, but his love was free to everyone, even some of the Arabs. When he saw that there was an Arab prisoner that no one visits, then he would visit him as well. That's what the stories say. We have to finish. Wow, it's very late. I have to finish. There are many, many stories that we're not able to tell. Maybe I would finish with one, I think, wonderful story, very strong. After in מלחמת העצמאות, as you may know, there were 35 warriors that were sent to Gush Etzion in order to try and supply it. And the למאד, exactly. And they were killed on the way. And the Arabs didn't let their bodies to be buried. So it took a time before they were able, and also they mutilated the bodies. So it took time. And the bottom line was that 12 bodies were unrecognizable. Now, of course, they didn't have DNA then, and they didn't have a TIFF photograph, anything that we have today. So 12 bodies they couldn't identify. And no one knew what to do. And they called Rav Aryeh Levin. And Rav Aryeh Levin said that he has a Mesora from Volozhin about Goral Agra. The Gra, Goral, lottery, but that's not the right word, but the Gra lottery. And they had a special Tanakh that he had for that sake. And they had a whole ceremony, which you cannot describe now, but very frightening ceremony at night with candles, everything, and Sifrei Torah. And he would open the Sefer, and they would read the first pasuk on the page. And every time he opened it 12 times, I think he opened it 11, because the 12 was, anyhow, it was the last one that remained. So on every one of the bodies, he would open the Sefer after doing all of the things that you need to do. And the first pasuk on the page would have the name of the body. And there were many people attending this. And we have their accounts. And it worked. I just described to you what there is. I mean, they have here the protocol. Now, it's a formal protocol because it was done by the IDF and was sent to the government. So it's a very formal protocol. And they have the psukim. It's mind-boggling. It's really amazing. So the first one was Binyamin Boglavsky. So again, they have a body. They open this special Tanakh, and the pasuk goes, Umimate Binyamin Bagoral. They go to the next body, and the pasuk goes, Halo Ben Yemini. Now, one of the victims was Oded Ben Yemini. The third one goes, Kol HaNefesh Haba LeYaakov. And there was one of them that was Yaakov Ben Atar. 11 names. The 12, he said, we don't do miracles for free, for nothing, because the 12 must be the last one that we didn't identify. And that was Yaakov Kutik, for which there is no pasuk assigned in the protocol. That's, I just described, that's a formal protocol, signed by the Adim, by the witnesses that were there. He's buried, he was niftar. Of course, there is a lot more to speak about, but time is up. He was niftar in 1969. He was zoche to come to the Kotel after the Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim. And he died 2 years later in 1969. He's buried in Sanhedria. And on his tomb, it was written, according to his request, no formal titles, only the father of the Asirim. That was the only thing that he allowed himself to be named after. And beneath it, it says, I ask everyone that comes to the grave to say with a full mouth, I believe in the Mashiach and in the resurrection that would happen במהרה בימינו אמן. And that's the story of this very, very special man. And I finish what I began to. If you find anything from what I just told uplifting and inspiring, then please go and read this book, either in Hebrew or in English. And I think that's it's a wonderful and very, very much מעודד sefer. So thank you so much. And בעזרת השם will continue next week.
Wow.